Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Brokaw. This is Today, December 9th. I'm here with Jane Pauley, and this entire half hour will be devoted to the murder of John Lennon, ex-Beatle, one of the best-known musicians and most influential people of his time.
Just last month, Lennon released his first album in 5 years. Its most popular song, ironically, was called Starting Over.
Just like starting over.
If you're just joining us, it's 7:15, and last night in Manhattan, John Lennon, age 40, shot and killed. With us now are four people who knew John Lennon in different ways. David Marsh of Rolling Stone, Barbara Graustark of Newsweek magazine, and Laurie, Kaye of RKO Radio. Let's begin with Laurie, Kaye. You saw John Lennon yesterday, and you talked about death, in a matter of speaking.
Well, he did bring it up. He mentioned that if he were to be left alone, if Yoko were to die before he wouldn't be able to cope with it. He wouldn't be able to survive. And he said that he hoped to God that he died before Yoko.
He also talked about the fact that he didn't like cult figures after people were gone, I gather.
A little bit. He was talking about cult figures, but perhaps.
But lest we give the impression that he was all talking about death too, you were saying he was essentially full of life and very optimistic about his future.
Especially with his music and with his son. He said that he hoped he had many years of creativity.
But what did you say, who was his audience? Who was the audience for Double Fantasy?
The people he grew up with. He said, I hope the young people like it too, people who maybe don't know my music. But this is for people I grew up with, the ones who survived the 60s and 70s and are coming through the 80s.
David, do you think it's possible to calculate the enormous contribution that John Lennon made, not just to the music of the time, but to the lifestyle, to the culture of not just the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, but probably the 20th century? He was one of the most important figures, don't you think?
I just think he was, I mean, I think it's real possible to calculate it, and you can calculate it in the grief that everyone I know felt last night. I mean, it was just all night. Everybody I knew was up talking to each other on the phone. I mean, coast to coast. I mean, talking to my mother this morning. I mean, talking to my friends in California. The tremendous grief. The guy was such an inspiration to so many people and on so many different levels.
What did he tell you yesterday about the status of the current recording session in which he was involved last night? He came home, as I understand it, for something to eat, and that's when he was shot.
Well, we, of course, talked to him right before he was headed to the studio, and he mentioned that he did have enough tunes for a second album. We assumed that he was going to either pull a single from the first or work on those other songs.
Be honest now. You're the music critic, David Marsh, for Rolling Stone.
Certainly.
What did you think of Double Fantasy?
I liked
the latest
it.
album.
I liked it. In fact, you know, one of the things I was thinking about last night was I remember hearing it. I was at David Guffin's house, and he played me the thing before it came out, and I remember thinking, gee, this is fresh, this is innocent, this isn't the greatest thing he's ever done, but you know, he's still got something.
The whole album, which is a dialogue between him and Yoko. He said, this is for all the people that survived. And his example was, did you survive? Did you make it through the 70s? How did your relationship suffer? Did you go through ups and downs, but did you come out? And this dialogue with Yoko was what he meant as something that would stand comparison to all man-woman relationships, not just his.
The surviving Beatles are said to be in deep shock this morning. Paul McCartney at his farmhouse in the south of England, where there's now a heavy security guard. Ringo Starr and George Harrison at undisclosed locations. There is shock and mourning in London, where Lennon had some of his greatest successes. Steve Mallory reports for us now via satellite from London.
Midday newspapers were the first to carry the news of Lennon's death.
Baby, John Lennon shot dead, baby.
The newspapers sold quickly. Londoners were shocked by the news. Record producer George Martin, often called the fifth Beatle for making the team internationally famous, said he was stunned beyond belief. Radio stations organized special programs to honor Lennon. They played old hits and old conversations.
As the world knows by now, John Lennon is dead, killed by a gunman who approached him as he was going into a block of flats in New York City. Now thousands of fans are gathering in the streets to pay tribute to the man from Liverpool who settled in New York, a town that he found similar to the London he once knew.
My life for the last 10 years, say, has been, or since I've been, quote, famous, unquote, has been it's changed a lot, but basically it's a bedroom, a studio, a TV, a night out, back home, you know?
Just a few days ago, Lennon talked with a BBC reporter wishing Britons a season's greetings.
It's a pleasure. Happy Christmas.
Happy Christmas.
Steve Mallory, NBC News, London.
We're back, and Jane Pauley has her record, actually the combined record collection of the Beatles, Jane and Gary. This morning you were saying the Sgt.
Pepper album
was your favorite.
Some say, I mean, this seems to be the rock and roll wisdom, that Sgt. Pepper was the finest rock and roll album ever made. Others might put the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds in there somewhere, but there isn't too much. There isn't. No, Sgt. Pepper is definitely the best.
Let's read some of the singles off of here.
And Abbey Road, too.
All right.
I mean, what were some of the
Well, what
titles?
I think is interesting is one of the
Abbey Road was my favorite.
the biggest. Look how inarticulate I am. I, like millions, am simply stunned. Just grieving really over the loss of someone. I never had any personal affection for John Lennon. I mean, I did not set him on any particular pedestal, but his music is definitely on a pedestal, and was, as I said before, it was like my life was set to music, and if so, it was Beatles music. Every major event of my life is attached to something, some song.
He was, when you were saying that you didn't set him on a personal pedestal, he did not set out to be an easy man to love.
No.
He constantly challenged people. He was on the cutting edge of lots of movements in the country. Lots of people thought that some people thought that in issues of war and peace, for example, that he was too supercilious. For example, that the bed-in in Toronto, where he and Yoko stayed in bed during, was that their honeymoon? I can't remember, or not, and wrote, "Give peace a chance."
Well, he apparently says now that the radicalism was all a fraud. Which may be, but I don't think the optimism and the idealism and the naivety, so naive, but artistically so. I don't think that was a fraud.
Well, he obviously felt strongly, and he was, I think, people say to me, you know, in your lifetime, who have been the important figures that you remember that you would like to have some chance to sit down and talk with. And I talk about, as I might, the conventional political figures of Mao and de Gaulle in his time, Churchill, and I always throw in the Beatles. I say, you talk about cutting across so many aspects of our life and what an enormous influence they had on behavior, on dress, on cultural style, on articulation of not just one generation, but many generations. I mean, how old were you in '65 when they kind of burst into the scene?
14.
Yeah.
15.
And then you take him through the generations, and Cliff was saying he's 28 years old, and John Lennon was my age. There are 1,000 generations between 40 and 28, frankly, and 1,000 things that happen, and they were at the nexus of every one of those things.
They were always on the crest of whatever was happening. First, it was just basic rock and roll. And their hair was long, and then the Indian period, and then the psychedelics, and then the peace movement.
John Lennon was on the cutting edge of all of those things, and remained, when we were talking about him earlier this morning, here we are talking about him again, talking about the Beatles again, and David Marsh from Rolling Stone was lamenting that a little bit, saying that John Lennon kept trying to separate himself from it. That would be impossible to do. I mean, he could not separate himself from that any more than Churchill could separate himself from
I heard
World War II.
the new cut from Double Fantasy, Just Starting Over, came on the radio last weekend. And I missed the first few bars of it and didn't catch that it was Just Starting Over. And I thought, and I commented that here we are listening to an old Beatles song. The Beatles is all over, Little Elvis Presley and the Beatles all over that Just Starting Over cut in 1980 for the latest John album.
Perhaps the saddest is Yoko Ono today.
Yes.
Yeah. Time now to take a look at the latest news. As I say, John Lennon, lead singer in the most popular rock and roll band of all time, is dead at the age of 40. Lennon was shot to death outside his home on Manhattan's West Side at 11 o'clock last night. As news of the murder spread, hundreds of mourners gathered at the scene, and they sang Beatles songs, lit candles, and remembered. In custody and charged with Lennon's murder is 25-year-old Mark David Chapman, identified as a freelance photographer from Honolulu, Hawaii. Police say that Chapman came to New York City a week ago, and he has been seen several times hanging around the Lennon residence. They say apparently he had a permit for the gun he used and that he made no attempt to escape, that he offered no motive.